Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to my talk about extended dependency injection. Just a few words about me, because it's about the topic, not about me. Just my name is Andreas from Studnitz. I'm from the most western part of Germany. I'm the co-founder of Internet, a small Magento agency, and in the Magento business for quite some time, like since 2008. For any questions you have, either you ask them directly after the talk or catch me up later this evening, tomorrow at the conference. Just ask me anything you want to know about dependency injection, about Magento development, about certification, whatever. I'm just here, I'm open, please just address me. So, I'm talking about dependency injection and especially about dependency injection in Magento 2 today. Dependency injection itself has been introduced into Magento in the version 2.0, and yeah, what's the purpose of Magento, of dependency injection in general? So first of all, it's to make clear which dependencies a certain class has. So for example, in Magento 1 you had all those calls like mage get model, mage get singleton, mage helper, whatever, inside the code, scattered over all of the class, and yeah, it's hard to see which other classes my class needs. So, and if you continue on that, it's hard to see which code you can remove, which modules you can disable, and so on. And dependency injection bundles all the dependencies in one place, and you don't have to look for them. You know exactly where they are. Then it eventually leads to better readable code. So if you do dependency injection the right way, you will have better code. And if you get used to the dependency injection code, you will be able to read it faster and better. And last but not least, it's about testing. It makes testing a lot easier because you see the dependencies directly, you have smaller methods, smaller classes, and it makes unit testing a lot easier, and that's one of the main reasons why Magento 2 has introduced dependency injection, because they are fully unit test covered. So, the basics about Magento 2, how does it look like? This is just an ordinary class in Magento 2. Don't care about what an attribute resolver is. Okay, you can see that. It's just a class with a constructor. So here we have that underscore construct function, which has a parameter. The parameter is named attribute metadata provider, which isn't important at all. It's just another class. And if you have that class, you have that available in your whole class as a dependency. So what is being done here is you have that as a parameter, and then you assign it to a class field. I hope you can more or less see it. It might be hard from the back because the screen is on the bottom. If you can't read it, either go upstairs or a little bit nearer. So, yeah, how does it work? We have seen here, we have a parameter, but how is it called? I'm not defining the class which calls the attribute resolver, because classes are not instantiated with a new statement in Magento 2, but differently. They are using the object manager. The object manager is just used internally. You don't ever use the object manager directly, but it's called automatically. And when is it called? It's called as soon as this class, which I want to use now, is being used. For example, in a constructor, for example, as a model, as another dependency, in a block, whatever. So what does Magento 2, or what does the object manager do? First, it looks into the constructor arguments, the parameters. It gets a type, and it looks up if an object of that type already exists. If it already exists in the object manager, which has a kind of a cache, it reuses that existing object. If it doesn't exist, it creates a new object of that type. And this is a recursive process. So when it creates a new object of that type, it looks... so let's look at our class again. We have that attribute metadata provider. The object manager looks into the constructor, looks up the class name, attribute metadata provider, and looks up if it's a new object or it's an existing object. So the next steps would be, we can inject not only a class, like we had before, but we can also inject an interface. So, but how does that work? The object manager doesn't know which class to use because it's an interface and you cannot instantiate an interface directly, but instead you have to instantiate a class. So to handle that, so here you see the interface has just a public function declaration, but no function content. So it cannot be executed, it cannot be instantiated. Instead, we are using preferences. And preferences are for telling Magento, for telling the object manager which class to use instead. So in this example, if we have that metadata interface as a constructor parameter, Magento 2, the object manager knows that I want to use the Magento customer model metadata customer metadata instead. So this comes in the di.xml file, which can be in every module of Magento 2. And this is how why you can inject an interface, and Magento still knows which class to instantiate directly. So let's make that diagram a little bit more complex. First step is still Magento is reading the type of the constructor parameter, and then it looks up if a preference for this type exists. If a preference exists, this type will be used as a new type. So this should be a class name, but this is a recursive process again. So there may be a preference for a preference again, and so it looks up if there is a preference for that new type which we have received, and uses this. And only if there's no preference existing anymore, this type is being taken. And if it doesn't exist, we can generate or we can retrieve an object of that type. And again, it looks up if there is already an object of that type in the object manager, and if it's not there, it will be created new, and if it's there, it will be reused. What's happening in the background is that Magento, that the object manager, is using sorry, blackout. Never mind. Okay, let's get to the next step. It gets a little bit more advanced. It's about arguments now, and in my opinion, every Magento 2 developer should know about the basics of dependency injection, but in my experience, many do not know about how to use the arguments. You sometimes see arguments in XML files, and you sometimes see class constructors which look like that. You see, the first 5 parameters you already know how they will be handled. The objects will be generated from the types, but the last 3 parameters, like base TMP path, base path, or allowed extensions, don't have a type. Or they could even be string, or int, or float, or boolean, or whatever. And so there must be a different mechanism on how to retrieve those types. And this mechanism is the argument syntax from the di.xml. So in the di.xml file, you have a section for a certain class type. Like in this case, it's the image uploader. It's an example from the Magento core, like all the examples I'm giving here. Then we have an arguments node, and then we have 3 arguments. And those are exactly these 3 arguments we have seen before. Base TMP path is exactly the same writing as we have seen here. $base TMP path. And base path is exactly the same as in the constructor, and a load extension is exactly reflects the parameter name. So this is important to have it matching exactly, and then you can insert your arguments there. So for example, you can insert a string as a base temp path and another string as a base path, and to get a little bit more complex, the load extensions is an array, and this array again can consist of one or more strings or integers, or again a subarray, or into subarray and a subarray. So this is used for configuration of classes more or less. So basic argument types we have available. You have already seen the string for the temp path. You can imagine a number, it's an integer. I think a float is possible as well. So if we don't want to have a string but a number, like here for the logo image width, you can use number as an argument type. You have a Boolean, I don't have to explain that, I think. Then we have an array, which can be nested, but doesn't have to. And we can have null as a value, which was new to me as well when I looked it up. But it's really rarely used, only more or less to override stuff. And the beauty in this argument syntax is that you can override and extend existing notations. So if we want to configure a class of a certain type, we have a DI.XML in the module, which the class belongs to, but we can have our own module overriding that stuff and extending that stuff. So, for example, if we, in our own DI.XML, we we add a section about a certain class, and we add an argument section like this allowed extensions, then we can add a new item into that. If we want to support whatever PDFs or whatever images. And so you can override stuff, like here with a null value. You can override the area we have and unset a value which is being set before. So there are a few advanced argument types. The easiest one is a constant. So you probably know that constant syntax, which can be used in PHP as well, but you can use it in XML as well. For the scope type, and we have the object. So the object here, it gets really interesting, because here this is the second method how to inject an object into a constructor. You can not only do that via the constructor parameters, but you can also use it in the arguments, and you can override an existing syntax, and override an existing argument with that by having your own class, for example, which inherits the original class or inherits the interface, implements the interface, and have your own implementation, which does something different or more or whatever. And so you can override stuff from the parameters without having to extend the original class. And what's nice here, you can set different objects depending on the area you are in. So in the first case we have the DI.XML in the etc directory, and in the second case we have the admin HTML DI.XML file, which overrides the DI.XML, but only if we are in the admin area. So here we can use a customer session everywhere except in the admin HTML area where we use the backend session. And that's a nice way to override things in certain conditions. Typical use case would be the Magento commands. Magento has a command line interface, a bin Magento file, where you can add your own commands to a list of available commands. And if you want to do so, you first have to create a command class, which extends the basic command class, where you have to configure the command and have to implement the execute method. It's not more than that. You can do anything in the execute method, and if you have a constructor in that class, you can have dependency in that. But then how to get our new command into the list of commands? Therefore, we are using the arguments. And there's a special class, a type with a command list interface and its implementation, which has an arguments node with one argument named commands. And this commands argument is an array of objects. And so, in this case, this is not the basic. This syntax happens in many modules. Every module which implements its own command has such a section in the DI.XML. And everything gets merged together in the end, like Magento does merging of XML files. And in the end, you have an array of not one object, but let's say 30 objects or 40 objects, and all implementing different commands. And the primary identifier is the cron command, the name here. And you can override existing commands, but you can also implement your own commands with setting a new name. And inside the node, you can add the class name of your new command. And how it looks like in the command list interface, or in the implementation of that in the class, we have a constructor, and this constructor has just one parameter named commands. It's an array type, it's empty by default, but it gets filled from all the DI.XML entries. And so if you debug the this commands section here, you will have an array with 30, 40 file objects of the different command classes. And this is how it looks like in the end. We just edit our cron whatever command or a custom command to that list by adding a DI.XML in our module and implementing a command class. And it's nothing more, but it uses the arguments syntax of the dependency injection quite well. Next topic would be the virtual types, a topic I like to avoid if possible, because it's becoming quite complex. Virtual types, I don't call them virtual classes, which some people do, but they are not really classes, they just look like classes. Virtual types are being used to reuse an existing class with a different configuration. And the class configuration is how you use the arguments. So this would be an example. This is the original class I want to replace or I want to duplicate. We've already seen that. It's the image uploader, which is taking a base path catalog product, for example, and for load extensions. But if we want to have a second image uploader, which is for categories, for example, which the functionality is almost the same, only we want to use a different base path, we want to use a different base temp path, and perhaps we want to use different load extensions, don't know. We have the possibility. Then we don't have to re-implement the image uploader class and extend it, but we can also just add a virtual type. This virtual type looks more or less like the original type, only we have, you see it here on the right, the original type as a type, and in the name attribute we have the virtual type name. So this virtual type name, it's not a class name, but it looks like one. On the right, you have a real class name which it uses. And in between the virtual type node, we have the arguments node, which has a different configuration of arguments, like catalog category as a base path. And now we have the same extensions, but this doesn't need to be. And then we can use that virtual type instead of the original type inside any XML file if we use it as an argument. So it's not well visible here. You must have a different class which uses our uploader. So this image upload class uses an uploader, and we define we want an object of the type category image upload, which is a virtual type, which you don't see directly. But if you look up in the DI.XML, you will see it's a virtual type. You will only have a problem if you don't think of the possibility of virtual types, but try to find that class which Magento catalog category image upload is, because it doesn't exist. It's just virtual. And this is why I strongly advise to add the virtual keyword to the class. Yeah, it's not a class name, to the virtual type name. Either at the end, which I like, or at the beginning, or somewhere in the middle, doesn't matter. But I'd like to see it in every declaration of virtual types. And I would have liked that Magento did it themselves, but unfortunately it's not the case. So we have to know that possibility and look it up in the DI.XML. And it's about complexity. You just saw I needed 2 classes and 1 virtual type to demonstrate the possibilities, and that's the absolutely easiest use case. So it already starts with some complexity, and I don't like to use it too much because it's really not so easy to read, and if you are implementing it, I have made the experience that it can get very confusing after, let's say, 2 weeks, when you have forgotten about the initial implementation and want to dive into it again and exchange some things also. I've tried it, it works nicely, but it comes with some complexity which I like to avoid. Usually there are other methods how you can reach the same goal. Okay, we have just talked about general classes, which are usually dependencies of, again, other classes. But how does it work with blocks? Blocks is one class type in Magento. If you didn't do Magento 2 yet, it's the same as in Magento 1, if you did that. So you can do the same thing as we just did in the DI.XML with the layout XML files. So here we have the front-end layout catalog product view XML, and we have a upsell block class, and we are giving an argument. So the argument is the type here, and you can read that type in the class. You don't use the constructor of the block class, but you can use it from the template file, for example, from the PHTML file, or inside the block class. That gets assigned automatically. You can use that that type string from anywhere in your class. So, for example, here we have block get type. Again, it's an example from the Magento core, and if it's related, it does this. If it's upsell, it does that, and if it's cross-sell, it does that. And this allows to share one PHTML file and one block class between 3 different purposes, like upselling, cross-selling, and related products. And so we can set the type of that block we just want to use by XML files, by layout XML, and just share the PHTML file and the block class. Make some less code and some nice coding depending on what we do, if the functionality is quite similar. Otherwise it doesn't make much sense. Then we have view models, which are a special case of those arguments we can use in blocks. View models are more or less the same as we have just defined the type, but it's an object. So in this example, we have the XSI type object. We have a breadcrumbs class with an argument named view model. So we can use that view model inside the breadcrumbs PHTML. And exactly this is being done. View model is block get data of view model, and take care, the writing is important, so the argument name must be exactly the same as what we have in block get data. And what we can do with that, it's quite quite nice. That's the possibility to add functionality to a block, either to an existing block, without having to overwrite a block class, but add new functionality via a view model inside which we can do everything. Or you can do it in your own class and don't have to have a block class. You can just use the default block class template, and which has no additional functionality. You can even skip the declaration of the class name, and then it takes the default and just declare a view model, and you will have the functionality of the view model itself. In general, you can do the same with a view model and with a block, but the rule of thumb is use a block for everything which modifies the output, and use a view model for everything which has to do with data. If you want to get some configuration value, if you want to get some products, categories, users, whatever, you can get them in your view model, and it makes for much nicer software layout. So some remarks about those view models. View models must implement the argument interface, otherwise it will complain. But you'll see that directly. And the argument interface is more or less an empty interface, which doesn't require to implement any methods. But still, it's being checked. And there's a security measure, a security reason, so you cannot insert any class as a view model. That could get a little bit risky. You don't want to inject, let's say, a product factory or product collection directly as a view model into your class. But we want to have some distance between models and view models. Then this only works for Magento 2.2. I think parts of it already work in 2.1, but the whole syntax is only in 2.2 upwards. So if you have a project which is on 2.2 or 2.3, you can use it and you should use it. If you have a module which you are selling for 2.1 and 2.0, you cannot use it. And don't overdo it. You can easily have 2 or 3 view models in one class if they have different purposes. They can be shared between classes. Let's say one for images and one for URL handling. But if you have 7 or 8 view models, you're overdoing it. And it's time to split your PHTML file into more files and add a little structure to that. So, dependency injection for blocks. We have seen you can use arguments, string arguments, or object arguments, and of course Boolean arguments, number arguments, and so on, constants. We can use preferences for blocks, so we can change which block is being instantiated by creating a preference. And we can even use virtual types for blocks, which can be confusing, but it's possible. And if you have 2 blocks which are quite similar and you want to just change the configuration and you don't want to use arguments, you can use the virtual types for that. So those dependency injection mechanisms are available not only for ordinary classes, but for all classes which are defined in XML files. For example, blocks, for example, widgets, and I think there are a few other class types which you can define in your different XML types. A little helper which helps you with to not get confused. That's a small PHP Storm plugin. I hope all of you use PHP Storm as your IDE. At least I recommend that. It's a plugin named Magento 2. yes, it's very creative. It's from a core developer of Magento 2, and what it does, it's freely available. It gives those nice orange boxes beside your interface declarations, class declarations, function declarations, and so on, and even inside the XML, which allows you to directly jump to where things happen. So, for example, jump to a preference, jump to a plugin, which is one very important reason why I use that, so you can see which plugins are active for a method, which I just want to analyze. And it really helps with orientation inside the Magento 2 code and in the XML. So, my conclusion about dependency injection in Magento 2, I really like using it. It's a very mighty tool set. You can do a lot with it. Yeah, for people who are new to the dependency injection, it can get confusing easily, and if you don't take care, it even gets confusing for yourself or more experienced developers. It favors composition over inheritance, which eventually leads to better code. But, as I said, use it with care, especially the virtual types. Just stay, just don't overdo it. And I'd like to close with a quote by Brian Kernighan. Debugging is twice as hard as writing the code in the first place. Therefore, if you write the code as cleverly as possible, you are by definition not smart enough to debug it. So, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I want to thanks. I just want to ask about the dependency injection in Magento 2. It's done only for constructors, and it makes huge problems in terms how many dependency we should hold when we instantiate an object. And as a result, some classes has too many dependencies, and that's a huge problem. And these classes cannot pass Magento static tests, and they should ignore it. Maybe you can recommend some practice to avoid that. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that problem. It's mostly from the core classes, where you have about 30 dependencies, for example, in the product class. It mostly results from converting old Magento 1 style code to Magento 2 in the early days of Magento 2. You're right, you should really avoid doing that in your own code. If you reach a number of, let's say, 8 or 10 dependencies, which is for me like the maximum you should have, it's time to split functionality in more classes. So it's hard to say as a rule of thumb, but your classes are too big. You have to put some of the functionality of that class into another class and use that as a dependency, which again uses like 3 or 4 other dependencies, and I think that's the only possibility you have. Okay? Yeah. One more question and then I'll have to finish, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so in your example about arguments in command list, you said that you can add a new item, and this item will be merged in the array. But what if we need to remove some item in arguments? Should we present a new argument with all the items without that item that we need to remove, or not?
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you. One possibility would to override it if, for example, if you want to remove the GIF entry here, to have a new item with the name GIF with the XSI type null, but In that case, the original class has to support it. So it has to check if there's a null value. In other cases, if it doesn't support that, it can get complicated. You can have a virtual type then, which starts from scratch, more or less, and doesn't take over the existing argument declaration and use that instead, if you have the possibility. But that could be a useful usage of the virtual types. Okay, if you have any more questions, I'm around, and just find me. Thank you.